Here we go. Here we go. One more time. Yeah. It's that time.
Is that In Sync?
That might be. Yeah, I think that is In Sync.
It's one of those boy band eras.
Mm-hmm.
We got a different band today that we're going to talk about.
Oh, look how you did. I wish I could say that that's why I wanted to lead it into, because it was a band.
Obviously, with Black History Month, we shouldn't just be focusing on these types of things during 1 month out of the year. This should just be in the annals of history to be talked about at any point in time. But it does give us a good, clear reason to do something as incredible and something I think that's not as well known, maybe more recently with kind of the push from Morgan Freeman. But the 761st Tank Battalion.
Yeah.
Not Brigade Battalion. And I think they're better known as the original Black Panthers. These guys didn't have a political agenda. These guys were just a segregated battalion within the United States military. And I believe that this is kind of the highest kind of battalion, or the most well-recognized battalion of all of these segregated units.
Oh, it depends on kind of what you're thinking. I feel like the Tuskegee Airmen, if you're talking about in World War II, I think that's probably a little bit more widely known, or at least recognized. These guys are basically just that, except, the armored version. These are the guys that were brought in as almost it was just kind of a token offer that we'll let these guys train. We'll figure out during training that they, it'll confirm what all of these fucking backwards thinking assholes were suspecting at the time. They don't have the capability of fighting as well as white soldiers. They definitely can't be fighting in like armor that's complicated to operate and work on and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, these guys are kind of breaking through these walls and proving everybody wrong. The Tuskegee Airmen are kind of doing the same thing in the air. So as far as, leading toward the actual integration of the United States military, the combination of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Black Panthers, and then the guys that actually were able to, I think in smaller numbers, participate as infantry. Most guys, most black guys that enlisted were put into support roles where they were driving Jeeps. The fucking Red Ball Express is a huge thing. And if you guys listen back to either, I believe it was the Battle of the Bulge episode, we talked about how integral that was in order to maintain the supply lines and the flow of supplies that allowed us to actually win the Battle of the Bulge. So, you get this group who essentially is put together to fail just to go ahead and prove all these people right. And just like with the Tuskegee Airmen, they're just like, oh, you think we can't take this job fucking seriously? Like, we're going to show you.
Yeah. We're going to not only meet your expectations, we're going to exceed your expectations, because those are the expectations that you set upon us. That
we're going to be good enough that you can't deny us, that you have no legitimate reason not to give us a shot.
One thing to be great at what you do, it's another thing to be undeniable.
And the other thing, too, is just, like Tuskegee Airmen, these guys are essentially fighting a war on two fronts. And it was fighting the battle over in Europe that they were participating in, and then also fighting the battle during basic training while they were training in the South, and then also the battlefield that they kind of came to when they came back home, just having defended their country, and there wasn't a lot of change that was happening.
No. So, before we get into this, don't forget ratings, reviews, subscriptions, wherever you listen to us or find us. 5 stars for the rating would be excellent. We love reading your reviews, any comments that you have. And we also haven't talked about it in a while, but we do have a YouTube page. For now, it is just the podcast that goes on there. If you don't want to just throw it on your phone to listen to at home or anything like that, you can always get onto YouTube and you can listen to episodes that way as well.
All right. Without making you guys wait any further, let's get into it. So, kind of have to go back and discuss essentially the more of the historical service record of black soldiers dating back probably a lot further back than people realize.
I would honestly say back to the beginning.
Yeah.
We're talking about the American Revolution. There were 9,000 African Americans that served in the Continental Army, Continental or Revolutionary Army. It was a Continental Army, right?
Yeah, because it was Continental Congress.
That's right.
And we were on our continent.
Yeah. They would serve throughout the Continental Army. They would serve in the Continental Navy. Black folks also served in the Navy during the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. They fought in, I believe it was the Battle of Lake Erie. We had the Louisiana Battalion of Free Men of Color that served in the Mexican-American War. So literally, even the ones that were fighting over in California, we're not going to send you over there because you're slaves, but the free men of color are going to go over there and serve themselves. This was them volunteering to go over and do this.
Well, kind of the same way we talked about it, probably a little bit more freedom, a little bit more liberal. They don't have to deal with people that look down on them as lesser. They're like,
yeah, okay,
we're going to go over there, we're going to make a little money, and then we'll probably just fucking hang out there.
Our numbers really start ramping up. 186,000 plus served in the Civil War. That was, I think, kind of a no-brainer as well. The Buffalo Soldiers would serve in the Native American wars that happened after that. We also have them serving in the Navy during the Spanish-American War. And then over 370,000 served abroad in World War II and at home. Or in World War I, excuse me. So we have this record that's been built, ingrained in our own history, you would say. Something that has always been a belief that we have the ability, that these men have the ability to go over and serve, and not only serve, but serve well.
So we come to 1925. The Army War College report came out that basically emphasized that white officers and strict segregation of black troops were going to be required once the new army was going to be formed.
Yeah, this is an excerpt from the Army War College's report. In the process of evolution, the American Negro has not progressed as far as the other subspecies of the human family. Holy shit. Holy shit. A race...
To have that like in a government report.
It gets worse. As a race, he has not developed leadership qualities. His mental inferiority and the inherent weakness of his character are factors that must be considered with great care in the preparation of any plan for his employment in war. In the past wars, the Negro has made a fair laborer, but an inferior technician. As a fighter, he's been inferior to the white man, even when led by white officers, which makes total sense because there wasn't this complete fear of a slave uprising back in the day when they were held in the South.
You weren't even putting them through training. You were using them for, like you were saying, the labor and support roles. The only time that they would be like, hey, grab a rifle and jump on the line was when you were down on troops enough to need to kind of fill the gaps. What the fuck do you expect is going to happen when no one has been prepared for this situation? Anybody, regardless if you went and grabbed the fucking farmer that was working there, the white dude, and was like, hey, we need you to fill in on the line. As soon as that fucking first volley of fire happens, that guy's like, I'm not ready for this shit.
Yeah, no.
Like, you guys didn't prepare me for this.
You literally just showed me where the trigger is on this gun, and now you expect me to be cool with being fired on?
Yeah, so what's the expectation there?
It's insane. Negro officer candidates should be attending training camps with white candidates. They should have the same instructors, take the same tests, meet the same requirements for appointment as officers as the white candidates. They should be sheltered, masked, and instructed separately from the white candidates. The eventual use of the Negro will be determined by his performance in combat training and service. If the Negro makes good, the way is left open for him to go into combat eventually with all Negro units. So we just laid out, they should have the same instructors. They should take the same tests. They should meet the same requirements for appointment as officers as the white candidates. They should be sheltered by themselves. They should eat by themselves. They should be instructed separately from the white candidates. We want them to have all the same things, but we don't believe that they belong in the same room at the same time with the white candidates. What the fuck?
Yeah, they had to list all the reasons. So they're like, these are all the reasons why we don't want to have to do this. But then they're like, but if we have to do this, this is how it has to happen.
Yeah, it blows me away. And so this lead up to World War II, military leaders were kind of cautioning against using black men in combat. The Air Force banned black recruits, but fortunately enough, this guy named General Leslie McNair successfully fought for segregated black units to be used in combat with experimental units used in 1941. So at least he was able to successfully, even though he died before they actually saw this happen, but he was able to successfully fight for them just to fight in segregated units.
Well, what's crazy is, okay, so that report comes out of the War College.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to World War I, do you know how many black soldiers were provided medals by other countries?
Well, wasn't that what it was? Wasn't most of the black soldiers that went abroad to fight were put in the French ranks so the French could command them because the United States didn't want to deal with them?
And they fucking served with distinction and they got all of these fucking medals. And was the thought process, well, French medals are a lot easier to get than American medals.
We had to come over and rescue them.
Well, and I hope that, McNair used that. That had to have been possibly a point to be like, no, like we have examples where if they're, commanded by someone who's competent and they have the training that everybody else has, yeah, they're going to fight just as well as anybody else. Like, let me try this.
If they earned white French medals, the same medals that white Frenchmen were earning, does that not put them on par then with the white race?
So McNair is basically like, hey, we need to go ahead and, we have the Tuskegee, stuff happening. We need to go ahead and allow these, troops to train with armor. Like the full scope of what the Army is going to be utilizing, let them, utilize themselves in all of these roles. And so we have the 761st Tank Battalion that's formed, and I think it gets formed and then it gets activated. So it's essentially what they consider constituted on March 15th, 1942 at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. And then I think it's actually activated on April 1st of 1942.
So before that, just flesh out the difference between I guess not the difference, but black recruits being banned from the Air Force and the Tuskegee Airmen.
Okay. So the way I understand it is how the Tuskegee Airmen were set up is it was a small, contained kind of like unit that was supposed to essentially train in the same way that I think once the 761st got to a certain size, they probably just said, hey, we're not accepting, any other, black soldiers for the armor division. We essentially have this pool that they're going to allow us to train. But, the expectation too was like, are they going to get to actually take place in combat? And if a lot of people had their way, no, they wouldn't have actually got that opportunity. So I feel in a way that they were just like, go ahead and provide them a bunch of guys that they can try to run their little, experiment with, but we're not going to keep pumping, soldiers into this where we can then redirect these guys to like the infantry.
So the experimental units that were used in 1941 for segregation within the Army is kind of what the Tuskegee Airmen were for the Air Force. Because you also, at this point in time, the 761st, I believe, is the 3rd Armored Segregated Black Battalion, but the other two hadn't ever seen any war experience.
Yeah.
So, or had never seen combat. So they were just drilling at home, and that's all they were doing.
Yeah.
So this first stop at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, they would be trained using M5 Stuart light tanks that required 4-man crews, and the men on the crews were...
Okay, so we'll get to the Sherman when we actually get to that. So the M5 had a driver down kind of lower. I can't remember if it was left or right. I didn't look at the diagram of the M5.
I think we're
Traditionally you had your driver kind of down low to the left or right. Next to him on either side, wherever he was going to be like the front machine gunner. And then up higher in like the turret area, you're going to have the that's where you're going to actually have either the commander who's able to kind of pop out the top and get a better field of vision, and then that's where you're going to have your main gunner.
And they were smaller tanks. They were lighter tanks. while they were at Camp Claiborne, they were taught to maintain them. They had to maintain the 37 millimeter main gun, and then the 30 cal machine guns that they had on them as well. They were taught to kind of how to sight in a target.
Yeah, so you would fire one long, one short, and then you would know where your target was. Well, so you're almost supposed to like miss the first two to go ahead and get your range.
I'm sure if you hit one or two, you probably don't got to worry about the third.
No.
But yeah.
Yeah, you compensate higher, you compensate lower, and then you know exactly where the middle ground is.
They weren't allowed to do this.
No.
The white troops at camp were allowed live fire. Mm-hmm. The black troops were not given any ammunition to be able to test these things out.
And then even when they were provided like one opportunity to fire. It was one round.
I don't know how you even call that training. You're going through the movements. It's like standing in the batter's box without a bat and just watching the ball come in and kind of taking swings at it. You're never going to know what it feels like to connect with the ball.
It's so insane because you have no frame of what are you firing to tell where you're actually, how are you dialing in on aiming on this? So it's like they're being set up to kind of fail in this situation.
Well, how do you know where your long is and where your short is to be able to sight it in if you can't fire a long or short? Exactly. It just blows me away, the fact that this was something going on the base. The white troops were able to fire shots. Black troops just weren't. Their final training would take place in Texas at Fort Hood. The crews were assigned to M4 Sherman tanks, and these, I believe, had the 5-man crews.
Yeah, so the M4 Sherman was basically the workhorse tank for the United States and actually kind of all the allies during World War II. And I'm going to geek out here for a little bit on this.
Are we getting into the fatal flaws?
Huh?
Are we getting into the fatal flaws of the Sherman?
Yeah, we can talk about after we talk about the tank itself.
Okay.
So the tank was so widely used that about 50,000 of them over the course of the war were actually produced. It was considered a medium tank. It was 8 foot 7 inches wide. It was 19 feet 2 inches long, and it was 9 feet tall. So kind of compared to other tanks, it kind of had a higher profile, which people weren't crazy about because the taller you are, the more visible you are.
Easier target.
The easier you are to hit. So the thing weighed 30 tons. So just thinking of the size of this, that tells you essentially how much armor this thing had. And even then, it was kind of considered on the lightly armored side compared to other World War II tanks. So 60,000 pounds for these tanks. It was powered by a 9-cylinder radial engine, the same type that they would have in like the radial aircraft.
Weren't they like 600 horsepower or something like that?
They were 400. So they could achieve like 30 miles per hour, which was actually on the faster side for a World War II tank.
If you see a World War II tank moving at 30 miles an hour, it looks like it's hauling ass.
Oh, yeah. And then later models, I think, got a little bit faster because they bumped it up to like 450 horsepower. The way these things were constructed, they were cast steel. So they were actually poured into molds. And the documentary I was watching on the tank, when you look to the outside of the tank, it has this weird, not pebbly texture, but an imperfect texture. Yeah. It's not smooth like a steel plate would be. Mm-hmm. You go to the inside of the tank, and it's the same way. So you know it's cast. It's got imperfections on the inside. Whereas like German tanks, a lot of German tanks were actually like welded out of like steel plates, and that's why they were a little bit more angular.
A weld's never going to be as strong as something that's cast, though.
Correct. And that's why I believe that they could probably use a little bit lighter armor is because it was cast. But that's also what gives the Sherman that distinct dome shape. That's why other tanks don't have that dome shape. On a full tank of gas, which was 175 gallons, it had a 120-mile range. So it was getting less than a gallon per minute. And then the big thing about these tanks, and we're going to get to the kind of the flaws within them and everything. The Sherman tank was designed to operate in pretty much any type of environment or theater. It wasn't like the Germans were basically, when they designed their tanks, they were designing them to pack a ton of firepower, but also to take out other armor. They were just like tank hunting tanks. That's not really the route that they went when they were designing the Sherman, and when they were selecting that one. They were like, okay, the main role of these tanks is actually, and is going to be much more frequently, we're going to be rolling into some place that there's not going to be tanks.
Yeah.
The likelihood of tank-on-tank battles in comparison to a tank rolling in someplace and just fighting against infantry, the disparity is enormous. Like tank on tank battles were pretty rare. And even then it wasn't these huge 10 tanks, 10 tanks. It was like we found 3 tanks against our 2 tanks and everything. Like stuff was spread out.
Difference was, though, there was usually artillery with tanks, right? Or was there still artillery within infantry?
It all depended on where you were because artillery took so much longer to set up. And there was so much more artillery because a tank is just that. It's mobile artillery that can move and pivot and do that stuff. Whereas the other artillery that they had may have been on trailers or anything, but you had to get stopped. You had to get it supported. You had to get it set up, and then you had to fire it.
And they did have just separate anti-tank guns, right?
They did. They had like tank destroyer guns. They also had tanks that were called tank destroyers that had just large guns on them, but a lot of them didn't have turrets. The gun could maybe go up and down a little bit, but that sole job of that is to not go in and support infantry. It's to go hunting for other tanks.
Gotcha.
The Shermans were designed essentially to fight against the most frequent like type of situation. They weren't going to have the thickest armor and compared to the German tanks, but they were made in a way that they could like supposedly go for like 4,000 miles without service. They could get to places. They were extremely reliable. The pieces on them, because they were all using these Sherman tanks, were if something busted and you had another broken tank, you strip the parts off that. It's all interchangeable. Stuff could be switched, like the tracks and the suspension could be switched out in like 40 minutes to an hour. They could swap out the transmissions on it if another tank got hit in the back and the motor blew. This tank got hit in the front and the transmission blew. But we have this other tank that, it's not, this stuff is malfunctioning. Pull them out, switch them in there. We have a tank that's functional. Whereas with the German tanks, those tanks there was a lot of different types.
Mm-hmm.
So like this part may not have fit on this part may not have been here. So if you end up losing a tank, regardless if you still are able to recover that tank, if you don't have any of those other tanks with spare parts, you can't just replace them. And how do you get parts shipped to you? Mm-hmm. You could have a bunch of different tanks in your area, and they're like, well, we sent you parts for these. They're like, this is for a Panzer. We're using Tigers.
This sort of feels like the hallmark of American engineering, you would say.
It's a jack of all trades tank is what it is.
Yeah, and a lot of it, though, like you're talking about, it's just plug and play. If we make everything the exact same way, we can make a million of the exact same part that can be used everywhere. They can be interchanged and switched. Probably not a great description or a great comparison, but probably the way that if you have a kind of a big 3, big 4 American car, Jeep, Chevy, anywhere like that, you can just take it in and get it worked on. If you have a European car, usually you have to find a specialty mechanic to work on it.
Yeah, exactly. And the outlook on it was, okay, in a one-on-one fight, this thing is probably not going to be able to take on like one of the more advanced German tanks. Mm-hmm. But if we get 3 of these things taking on one German tank, we're going to get a flank. We're going to be able to hit it on the sides where the armor is thinner. These things can take it out because this thing can only target one at a time. So whereas the Germans were more focused, I guess, on the quality of these things, which is weird to say because their ship broke down all the time, they were so invested in each of these tanks where the Americans were like, we're just going to produce these en masse and we're going to overwhelm them.
Yeah.
So that being said, the crews kind of had to sacrifice survivability. Well, not the crews, but essentially the manufacturers, sacrifice survivability in order to kind of make this jack of all trades tank. So in these, kind of getting back to it, you had a 5-man crew. So if we're looking at this like your normal, SUV, in the driver's seat, that's actually where the driver is going to be. He's going to be in the front left, but he's going to be sitting down lower. He has a hatch above him that opens up to the front top of the tank. And in that hatch is built essentially a periscope to where when he closes that, he can have his eyes against that. And that's where he's driving. It's
called buttoning down.
Yeah. And the field of vision is so narrow. Like it's so weird to think about because like in tank movies, you always see what's going on around you because it's always cutting to the outside of the tank and everything. When you're inside this thing and it's buttoned up, your only way of seeing anything is either through the gunner's scope, maybe the periscope up by the tank commander, and then the little periscopes that are on the driver and the gunner sitting to the right of him. But these aren't like, hey, I'm going to pop my submarine periscope up and rotate all the way around and see everything in front of me. They're fixed. They have a small field of view out in front of them, so they can't see a ton.
Your blind spot is everywhere, basically.
Unless it's right in front of you and maybe a smaller width of vision. No, you have no idea what's going on the side of you. That's also why it was so important for infantry and tanks to work together. Because, yeah, a tank getting to the side of you, you would probably hear something or see something coming, maybe catch a glimpse of it and be able to turn that. But if you have infantry hiding and they pop out with one of those Panzer Faust, whatever, the tank killer, the handheld ones, the infantry was also supposed to be there advancing with you to shoot those guys to prevent them from doing that. The tank's job was to move in and clear out any machine gun nests or artillery that were firing on them, clearing the way for the infantry to move up and kind of mop up everything. So you had the driver who went with a set of pedals, kind of like you do with a car, but to steer it, it was 2 sticks, independently operating the tracks. So if they were both essentially just kind of, sitting in front, the tank would be going forward just evenly, straight forward. You would then push one. If you push the left one forward, essentially that would speed up that track.
So
then
it
you
would turn you
to
right.
the right. So if you were to push the left one up and pull the right one back, it would just simply try to rotate it really quickly to the right. If you did it the other direction, it would rotate you to the left. So it was like a stick steering type thing. Machine gunner to his right, also set kind of low, had the little periscope, and operated a 30 caliber machine gun that was in this like ball swivel mount that could get a lot of range. His job was to basically just do the thing that the infantry was also trying to do. His job was to get the smaller, closer targets because that big fucking cannon up there can only move so quickly and it can't exactly just fire down and hit an individual.
Do you think that was the ball turret was inspired by the plane, or do you think the ball turret in the fortress was inspired by the tank?
Sorry, in a different way. What I meant by that is, imagine you have the barrel of the machine gun.
Yes.
There was just a ball around the end of the barrel to where it could rotate in a socket, like a ball joint.
Gotcha.
And so the machine gunner was still inside, and he was, pulling the trigger. He just had more of a range of motion.
Got it.
On that gun. You then had the gunner, who essentially sat up and behind the driver and the gunner, and the machine gunner. This guy was operating the main gun. He sat to the right of it, and you would have basically the breech, like the chamber for where they would load and unload and it would eject the shells, sitting to his right. He then had a viewport that had, the crosshairs and the designations for distance, things like that. And he would have full control of the turret, which could rotate electrically. So even if the tank actually lost power from its gas engine, it could still actually rotate the turret on its batteries to still try to operate. Because if you lost a track, you didn't just want to be dead in the water. You still had to be able to kind of fire and try to drive off. Because you could still hit another tank and, destroy that one. Then you just repair your tank.
Well, to also buy some time and some cover for anybody that's trying to escape from. They had a hatch underneath?
Yeah, so it had the ways to get in and out of the tank. You had the 2 hatches, one above the driver, one above the machine gunner. You had one in the top of the turret where the gunner, the main gunner, the reloader, and the tank commander would get in. And then I believe down below, kind of where either the machine gunner or the driver were, there was a removable panel that could be taken off and they could escape underneath it.
Probably the best way to go.
I mean, depending on which way the tank was facing, I might take the driver or the machine gunner getting out the front of it.
Yeah. But it's easier to shoot something popping out of the top than popping out of the bottom.
100%. Yeah.
But also, I'm sure you covered it in stuff that you would research too, but for the most part, they would only really button these things up at war. So if they're just driving along the road, their hatches are open, they're driving with their head sticking out of the top of it, so they can kind of see everything. You're also getting a breeze because these things can get hot as hell. This was like before the invention of fans, right? To be able to put in there.
Not only that, you're in this hot as fuck thing with 4 other dudes, and you're not running into showers all the time.
No, you're smelling 10 nuts.
Yeah. Ugh. It gets fucking horrible. And especially with the mix of like the fucking gun, the fucking cordite or whatever it was exploding, because a lot of that stuff is coming back into the tank. Probably some fume leaks from the engine.
Yes.
yeah, it's just a fucking soup of disgusting, which kind of tries to paint a picture of, what these guys just went through just simply being in the tanks themselves. So yeah, like you said, if there was an opportunity for the commander to actually have his head still out, even during a firefight or during a battle, he would still do that as much as he could until he really had no other option, because that's the only way to see to the side and behind, where he is then ordering where to fire and where the gunner is supposed to aim. So you have the gunner, he's sitting to the right, he has his viewpoint, he has all the controls to, turret side to side, and then the actual gun up and down. Behind him, you had the loader, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This guy essentially just had to sit behind the gun and would just, the shells would eject. There was a way for them to get the shells, I think, out of the tank.
Terrible job. Probably the worst job in there, right?
No, it was definitely the worst job out of all of them. And then basically have to reach into like almost like a little secured rack that was just right to the side of them and pull more shells and just keep loading and, however much they needed. Eventually, because they found that this was a huge liability, because if the tank got penetrated, what would happen is it would get hit, and then all of a sudden, 5 seconds later, the tank would explode.
Yeah.
And it's because, and it got blamed on the fact that it was using gas instead of diesel, because gas has a much more explosive human component to it. What they actually discovered for the most part was these tanks were getting hit, and then it was igniting the cordite in these rounds, and then it was just exploding on the inside. And by that time, of course, it's going to explode the gas that's in there. And so you're going to try to make the connection, well, these things are just getting hit in the gas tank.
Did you see anything about the percussion effects on the inside of the tanks?
Yeah.
I'd imagine that was probably the worst part of it, besides the smell.
A sealed steel container with explosions and concussions going. Fuck, man, you could get liquefied like that. So, and then up above, kind of sitting back above and behind the gunner, is going to be the tank commander. Now, this guy's pretty much runs the entire show. He's going to direct the tank where to go. Everyone's taking his orders. And when you're a crew in these tanks, you essentially have to, you're all wearing, a lot of you are wearing headsets because the thing is loud as hell, because there's not a lot of insulation from the engine. You got this big fucking gun that's also going off. So they had like an internal intercom system, but a lot of the time they would just resort to actually using like touch cues. So if you're sitting and you're the gunner, tank commander's telling you, okay, I got a tank, off to your left at this many degrees. If it was just the job of the gunner to try to get there, he starts rotating the turret around. However long it takes to rotate that turret around, that's how long that enemy, if they've seen you, has a chance to fire at you and kill you. So instead, he would just tap the driver on the left shoulder, and the guy would be like, I know to turn left. And I'm not sure exactly what, everyone probably had their own cues. Yeah. I don't know if it was, hey, if I tap you 3 times, I want you going left for 3 seconds. Rotate this gun even quicker and let me shoot this thing. It would be to the point where if the tank commander was, seeing something outside, he saw a group, like a machine gun nest over to one side, but the tank was actually, the main gun was pointed another direction. He could then signal down to the machine gunner, hey, look to your right a little bit and put some fire on this. So there was a ton of just shorthanded communication. These tank crews had to be like families, man, and you had to trust in everyone doing their jobs. The armor on these, sorry, I'm still geeking out over this thing.
Yeah.
The armor was between 1 inch to 3.5 inches thick. It was thickest around the turret because essentially that's where your commander and every point, that's the gun that's going to be firing. It's going to be the thinnest on the sides and in the back, because those are the places you're always trying to go forward if you're in a battle.
They don't have to absorb as much shock from the firing as the turret does.
Correct. And because of the shape of it, the front of the tank had pretty substantial armor, but the top, like where the actual like hatches were and everything for like the driver, didn't have to be as thick because they were, they weren't facing dead on where you're going to be hitting. That's also where we get artillery coming in. That's going to be such a big deal for these tanks and such a killer, is because these things are also getting hit from above where they're not expecting to in other tank battles. And so it's going to be a problem when that armor's a little bit thinner. Huge difference between the M5 and the Sherman. The gun was a 75 millimeter. They went from a 37 millimeter gun to a 75 millimeter. Yeah. Now, This was still a big gun, but again, just like this tank was designed, it was designed to be a jack of all trades. They just needed this thing to be able to put up a fight against tanks, possibly kill some every now and then, but also just shoot into buildings, destroy nests and pillboxes. And a 75 millimeter would do just that. It was used by other countries for their tanks, but the Germans started putting, 88 millimeter guns on some of their tanks.
Those things sounded nasty.
Well, here's the thing, is not only is it going to be a larger round traveling with more force, you're extending your range.
Just momentum.
The range in the sense of like you had to be within a certain distance of these German tanks to be able to not have your shell lose velocity and just bounce off the armor. If you were too far, it didn't have the kinetic force to penetrate it. Whereas you could be quite a bit further in a German tank, fire, and still have that force to take these other tanks out. So being able to engage at a longer range gave the Germans a pretty big advantage in regards to that. The other advantages kind of that the German tanks had over the Sherman, they had an armor slope that was more conducive to
ricochet.
Yeah, causing ricochets and like what would you call that? Non-direct hits. Where the tank was, increased survivability.
Less flat surfaces to make a connection on.
The overall design, again, the Germans were looking to try to perfect these things for certain purposes, where the Americans were like, we need this thing to do everything. And then their tactics. Because frankly, man, they had been doing this stuff since 1939.
They were good.
When they were invading Poland and invading France, even the guys that weren't trained or were new were still receiving all of that tactical advice and all of that tactical training from all of this real world experience that these, German tankers had had.
Was the 50 cal machine gun on the Shermans was that clearing nests, or was that, because the 50 cal is probably anti-air gun too, right?
Yeah, it's usable for that. So you would have the 30 caliber in the front. You'd have another 30 caliber that was it was inside, but right next to the turret, to where it could fire at lower targets and things like that. And then once you popped out, the person that was standing up out of the top hatch actually had a turret that was on like not a gimbal, but its own little rotational ring, to where he could then spin that around. So if he had to turn that around and all of a sudden you drive past something, it was a trench that was hidden over to your right, all of a sudden a group of Germans pop out getting ready to hit the back of the tank, he could turn around with that 50 cal and light into them. Also, like you said, if they were under air attack, dive bombers, if you had a group of Shermans together and you were all aiming up with these 50 cal, I mean, those are the rounds that are being used by the German airplanes, the German fighter planes. So
might as well give it a shot.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of it was dual purpose type stuff. And then they had a 2-inch smoke mortar.
What was that for?
Okay. So you're going to make me keep going in on this.
One more after that.
Okay. So the smoke mortar was basically for escapes. So if you have this smoke mortar and you have all of this artillery, you have all these guns dialed in on you, all of a sudden shit starts going off, all of a sudden you need to retreat, a couple tanks are hit, you could drive and pop a couple of these smoke mortars that I believe would fire out in front of the tank. It would create a smoke screen. All of a sudden you just have to move 20 yards to the right and they're like, fuck, we don't know where they're at.
Magic trick, basically.
Exactly. So yeah, it was a way to go ahead and, get the fuck out of situations.
Last question about them. I saw in a documentary that later on they actually had napalm nozzles on them.
The crocodile, I think.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah, they use those a lot in the Pacific Theater for clearing pillboxes and stuff like that on like the islands.
The documentary that I saw said that they had that on the front of the tanks as they were going through the Seigfried Line.
They probably had a couple of them.
That's crazy to be able to fire liquid, basically Greek fire out of the front of your tanks.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, that tells you all about the M4 Sherman. So this is what these guys were sent to train with. This is what they were going to be fighting with. One of the craziest things to me about these tank crews is kind of like we discussed in the Allied bombing campaign episode. So many people had to be behind the scenes to keep this stuff operational.
Well,
so you have this huge group of, the 761st that actually aren't even the guys operating the tanks. They're all of these support people, the mechanics, the fucking ammunition runners, all that stuff. So the crews themselves, though, because if they got out in front of the line, these guys for the support roles weren't going to be exactly following. They weren't, they had to be kept safe. And so if all of a sudden you're out and you're miles away from essentially where your repair guys are, something goes wrong with the tank gets hit with something, your first job is to try to, neutralize whatever took you out and then maybe get the fuck out of there in that tank.
Yeah.
It's an insanely valuable resource. So all of these crew members were trained on how to work on this tank. And because it was a universal type training, all of these guys knew how to operate on this same tank. So they could get put into another tank and know exactly the operation of it and exactly where stuff needed to happen, to be replaced or anything like that. Not only did they know how to operate on the tank, they all knew each other's jobs as well. They had them
cross-trained.
They had them all learn everybody else's role, because if someone got, taken out, out of commission, couldn't perform the role, got killed, whatnot, someone had to step in to be able to do that. You can maybe go without the 30 caliber guy to the right of the driver. Can't go without your driver. Someone's got to step in and fill that role. Your loader gets taken out and gets hit. Tank commander can probably go ahead and close that hatch and start reloading the tank if you guys are firing at stuff. Mm-hmm. There's certain roles that were essential to the operation, even trying to retreat of those tanks. And so everybody had to know everybody else's position.
Well, not to mention, it wasn't just knowing these things inside and out and knowing how to fix them. It was the pride that these units took in making sure that these tanks were clean as they were training during camps at Fort Hood. It was naming them. It was understanding everything that had to be greased to keep these things in tip-top shape. It wasn't, you wouldn't call it pride of ownership, but it was almost like every unit had an affinity for making sure that their tank was so ready to go and prepared that once they got out there and didn't have the time to be able to stay after and fix their machine, they were so well versed from staying after and doing it that it was just a no-brainer every single time they got into it.
It's almost as if their lives depended on understanding everything about the functionality of this tank and basically knowing what to do if something went wrong.
And at the same time, you have this training that's going on where they train for almost 2 years. Mm-hmm. So as they're training, as they're getting better and better and better at what they're doing, you see these other battalions that may not have trained for as long, that may not be as good, that are white units that are getting sent over during World War II, and they're just sitting there waiting their turn. And the places that they were waiting their turn were not nice places for them. During that time, they were subject to a lot of racism, not only on the base from superiors, being called names, being treated poorly, having your beds taken, anything that they could do to try to rattle these guys for even the smallest infraction, or just something that they made up because they were having a bad day. Outside of the base, they were stationed right outside of this town called Alexandria, Louisiana. You would have white military police and black military police that would be in town, that would be constantly keeping an eye on them as they're
still an extremely segregated town.
Yes.
With extreme, segregationist rules.
This is the Jim Crow South. This is where black people have to go down the alley and order from a window back there instead of being let into a restaurant.
You got to come in through the back if you want to see the movie.
There's so many different things that are going on, and if these townspeople have any sort of problem or understand, something incorrectly, or just feel like being racist assholes, the military police would end up coming and dealing with these cases. We do have a case, former first lieutenant that was arrested by MPs after an argument with a bus driver. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, who is a fucking stud, and we'll talk more about him in a little bit, refuses to punish him.
He was the token white guy.
Yeah, he was the token white guy. He was the commander, or I guess the lieutenant colonel of the 761st.
He was the guy in charge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Refuses punishment because he didn't believe that this argument that he had with the bus driver, where he was not sitting in the back, the bus driver told him to go to the back. The bus driver then calls the MPs. They come and pick him up. They accuse him of being drunk. He doesn't drink. Bates knows that this story is being punched up and is just there to try to punish this black recruit. He refuses punishment. the post commander goes ahead and transfers this first lieutenant from the 761st to the 758 because he knew that that commander of that troop would then court-martial him for insubordination. Ultimately, he ends up getting acquitted. He gets an honorable discharge from the military from the 761st, and he goes on to break the color barrier in baseball because this was Jackie Robinson.
Yeah. Fucking crazy, right?
Absolutely incredible how these worlds cross. This guy faced so much discrimination that after he got done with that, he's like, you know what? Fuck it. I didn't get to do this in the military. I'm just going to go break baseball. Like, I'm going to change the world in one way or another. I couldn't do it in the military. I'm going to change the game of baseball.
And, you know, these were not isolated or rare incidents. It's, again, like these guys are training to essentially fight to like for, you know, your country and everything like that. And these people are like, nah, like we don't want you to be here. There was an incident where I'm trying to remember exactly who it happened to. Something had happened in town. The guy came back, and because of it, they were like, fuck this, we're not dealing with this anymore. They went and got like 6 of the tanks. And it was a pretty big, I think it might have been some type of like fight or something like that like the white MPs may have done something. And so they were going to actually drive the tanks into town and being like, quit fucking with us. And so as they're getting ready to leave the base in these fucking Shermans, Bates comes out and he's like, you guys can't do this. Like, hold up for a little bit. Like, I get where you guys are coming from. I get the anger and everything. Let me actually try to take care of this, get this thing sorted out. If not, I'll fucking go down there with you.
I'll escort you down there.
He's like, I'll escort you down there. Bates did end up getting the shit sorted out and everything, so that didn't have to come to fruition. Those guys didn't get kicked out or court-martialed, because you know that's what would have fucking happened.
Yeah.
Bates would have tried to defend him, and it would have been the same thing.
That's the best case scenario.
Oh, yeah.
Those guys would have been hung outside of that town.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Colonel Bates was a very cool dude. And I say that not just in passing, but he took the assignment. All of the other commanders and all of the other leaders believed that if you were assigned or you took a role within a segregated black regiment, that you were almost basically being punished. You didn't want to be there.
It was like career suicide.
Yeah, you didn't have respect for your soldiers. You didn't have respect for yourself. You were looked at as a second-class leader, just like these guys were looked at as second-class soldiers. Paul Bates actually refused promotions that would have taken him out of the 761st because he loved working with them so much, believed in them so much, and actually cared about them enough to know that if he was taken out of that role, there was a pretty good chance that they were going to get some other white dickhead in there that was just going to punish these guys for no reason.
It was going to be the situation with the 758 that Jackie Robinson got sent to, and he wasn't willing to allow that to happen. So he was like, nah, I'm good at Lieutenant Colonel right now. I'm going to stay where I'm put. He eventually did make full colonel. I don't know how far after the war that was, but he eventually did make full colonel. Comes time for essentially, you know, these units have to actually receive like reviews and everything like that. So this guy named General, what was his name?
Ben Lear.
Ben Lear ends up coming, you know, reviews everything about the unit, takes a look at the training, all that kind of stuff. And after reviewing this, ends up providing them with the superior rating.
That sounds good, right?
Superior rating is going to lead you to getting deployed.
Yeah, they were deemed combat ready. They would receive their order on June 9th, 1944 for an overseas movement 3 days after D-Day. This is kind of interesting to me just in how all this plays out because they had been there for 2 years. Like I had said before, they had seen these other regiments, these other battalions go out and fight. They were the white battalions. So is it that they finally overcame this race barrier, that they wanted to do right by the 761st, that they believed that they had earned it, that they had shown that they were superior? Or was it a situation where after D-Day, there were so many tanks that were taking out after the Normandy landings that this was more of a move of necessity over a move of breaking color barriers?
I'm going to go with column B.
They would prepare from New York. They would be loaded on board the British troop carrier, the Esperance Bay. They would arrive in Britain September 8th, 1944. While they were on the boat, of course, they weren't allowed, being a segregated group, to be on the decks or on the deck or
Like
on
the
the
top
levels
deck or
with the
something,
whites.
yeah.
They were actually put with the help. The the guys that were running the ship were basically their roommates. Once they ended up landing in Britain, was it the captain of the ship had actually written them a commentary letter.
Just like a sterling review, being like, these were the fucking greatest guys to have on my boat.
Yeah, and I imagine there was a fair amount of cards and gambling and fun stuff being played. They were sounds like they were a good time. They knew how to be respectful. And we're talking about them leaving on a boat from a country that didn't ever really accept them. They left from New York. Things were better in New York. Things were by no means good in the North at this point in time, in the northern states. But they were brought over to Great Britain, which didn't believe in any sort of segregation. They would then be moved to France. The French remember the troops in World War I that were put under their command. They're being sent to a place where they don't really have to worry about it beyond the normal worry that they shouldn't have had, but had to have.
This is kind of like, this is what I feel like the progression of like countries. And I know that there's, every country has its own fucking flavor of racism, whatever you want to say. But those other countries had been so established so long that they just kind of looked at American racism. They're like, oh my God, you guys are still on racism. Like, yeah, we stopped kind of, doing that so much a long, long time ago. You guys will get there. Maybe.
They still weren't pumped about it, but at the same time, segregation just wasn't a belief.
Yeah.
This was kind of this transfer over to Europe in this situation. There was something that went through the black press. It was, you and I had talked about this a little bit before about just why in the world you would be treated like this in a country and then want to go fight for it. It was called the Double V campaign. It was the Double Victory campaign. It was victory against fascism that was sweeping Europe, and it was also the victory at home to come back on a more even footing.
Victory at home.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we talked about that actually during the Tuskegee episode a little bit.
We haven't done Tuskegee yet, have we?
Yeah.
When?
Like 2 years ago, buddy.
Oh, that was your one-on-one.
We did it during a February episode.
Was it?
Yeah. We've done so many episodes.
Yeah. Okay.
So they end up staying in England for not very long. They're basically trying to get acclimated. They're doing a little bit of training. I believe that they didn't bring over the tanks that they had initially trained with and kind of had as their tanks with them. They were already going to have those over there. And so some of them got acclimated, I think, with their equipment. You had to have them rename them or name them the same thing, make the little customizations to it.
Kind of messed up, but at the same time, you understand why they wouldn't bring, what'd you say, 60-ton tanks?
30-ton,
30-ton tanks, 60,000-pound tanks. Probably didn't need to make the journey over there.
Another thing, too, about the Sherman is if you look at it, the the cannon barrel seems really short in compared to like the German tanks and stuff. They made it short so it didn't stick out too far from the front of the body, so it was easier to like stack them and store them when they were actually transporting them so they could get more in.
That ain't bad. That's pretty smart.
Well,
I forgot to mention, before you get onto that, their patch.
Yes.
The Black Panther patch. Their motto for the 761st was come out fighting. This is so big because just in the grand scheme of this whole thought of the United States versus Germany, fascism against democracy, all of these different things, during that same point in time, you had Joe Louis, the legendary boxer, the African-American boxer, going against Max Schmeling, the German. In the 1936 fight, Louis ends up losing to Schmeling. They have a rematch in 1938. When they ask Louis about his strategy, he says he's going to come out fighting. So Louis comes out, beats the shit out of Max Schmeling. All of a sudden, you see good versus evil. You see good come out on top. You see democracy come out on top. 761st goes ahead and takes that and runs with it and uses that as their motto, come out fighting.
Yeah. So, after being in England for a very short period of time, just a little over a month, they actually land on Omaha Beach on October 10th. Now, D-Day happened back in June, but because still trying to capture these deep water ports, so many supplies were still coming over the Mulberry harbors and being unloaded where that initial beachhead was created. So the 761st ends up landing on Omaha Beach. They arrive with, I believe it was, 6 white officers, 30 black officers, and 676 enlisted guys.
Let's walk through this because this is something that kind of got me just thinking about. For basically all of these guys in the 761st, this is your first trip on a boat.
Yeah.
You're going across the country to another country.
Well, I think that was the case literally for pretty much any of the soldiers in World War. Yeah.
Except for when they pull up on Omaha Beach, there is just wreckage, and this land is scarred and beat to shit after the landings. You see tanks that haven't been pulled off that are still just in ruin. You see barbed wire strewn everywhere.
Stuff just gets pushed off to the side. We'll get to this shit later. Time right now is for unloading supplies and unloading supplies only. We've got to get as much shit on this beach even months later. So, yeah, probably not the best omen when you end up like pulling off the landing craft in your tank, and as you're driving up, you turn to your right and you see just a tank with just riddled full of holes. That you're just like, oh fuck! Like I'm driving this same tank.
Is that it? Shit, that's a Sherman too.
You don't think about the psychological effect that's having on your soldiers. Like, yeah, maybe like I know you cleared the bodies and everything, but get rid of the shit that everyone's using.
Yep. Why'd they say they needed us over here? Oh, it's because they ran out of guys in tanks.
Yeah.
Shit.
All right. Well, they've landed in Europe. They're going to get into this shit. But before that, let's take a bathroom break.
Cool.
Well, hey there, all you sexy historians. How you guys doing?
It is time for
socials.
Where can they find us on Instagram?
If they want to follow us, they can find us at Historically High Pod on Instagram.
That goes the same for Threads as well. You can also find us on Twitter.
Ooh, tell them about Twitter.
Historically High. That's historically HI on Twitter.
And if you want to email any of your comments or suggestions, where can they find us at, Adam?
At historically high podcast at gmail.com.
Gmail. All right, and back to the show. All right, so these guys have landed in Europe. They're ready to get down to business. Who are they joining up with?
General George Patton's Third Army. Patton was a fairly magnanimous man, and not probably, he's a fairly racist dude. He didn't always believe that black people should be on the front lines fighting, but when push came to shove and he needed a tank battalion...
Do you mean he never believed?
Yeah.
He never...
Even afterwards, didn't really believe it. He was given the 761st.
He requested them. He requested them.
He requested a good group.
Yeah.
And that's what he was given. So, of course, on the first day, he lines them up to give them a speech. He stands on top of the half track and he says, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would have never asked for you if you weren't good." Yeah, you're just looking for good. "I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and you kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down. They say it is patriotic to die for your country. Well, let's see how many patriots we can make out of those German sons of bitches."
So inspiring. So very, very inspiring.
And then after that, he goes ahead and gets off the half track and goes and talks to his guys, and he goes, "They seem like they could be good fighters, but I don't believe that they're going to have any success."
Yeah.
Just immediately walks back what he says in private. So on their way to the front, the battalion would travel through these liberated towns, and every single time they came through, they were just welcomed as these liberators. The locals absolutely loved these guys. They would line the streets as their tanks were coming through towns. There were even some towns that had brass bands that would come out and play them through.
I think the biggest thing is they did that anytime these armored units or soldiers would move through the towns. The simple fact that it wasn't they didn't differentiate anything. Like it wasn't like they came out and they were like, oh, it's like, it's black guys, like everyone go back inside. It was the same reaction. That's where they were at, where it was just like it didn't matter to them. They that wasn't even a thought to them. They're like, these people are here to help like liberate us.
Yeah, and because they didn't have that predisposition, that belief that they were something separate. It changes just the juxtaposition of thinking about showing up on the beaches in Normandy and seeing all the wreckage and all the carnage from the war. And you're like, fuck, what are we over here doing this for? Is this really worth it? And then you're going through these towns and you get to see the appreciation of these people that were liberated from the Germans that love you. And it's kind of like, okay, now I'm starting to see why this job is so necessary.
Thing. These people don't give two shits about our skin color. They give a shit that we're here. And it's like, it's the exact, in a majority of people, it's the exact polar opposite over here. It's just like, oh,
back then,
it's in Europe. They're like, oh, you're here. In America, it's like, oh, you're here.
Yep. Completely just different in pretty much all aspects. They were broke down into three companies. You had Able Company that was led by Reuben Rivers. Now, Reuben Rivers is a very special man. He's going to play a part in a few of these different battles, and then towards the end, you had Baker Company that was led by Captain Johnny Long. You had Charlie Company that was led by Captain Charles Pop Gates. He was nicknamed Pop Gates because of his age. He wasn't actually that old because most of the recruits in the battalion were anywhere between 18 to 22. So if you were 26 years old, they'd probably call you Pop.
Yeah. Which is even crazier, man. Like, I know that, like, soldiers across the board were just fucking young, but at this, like, just even thinking about it from the standpoint of being like, man, these guys in these fucking tanks were literally just kids. They'd learned to drive a fucking car just a few years ago, maybe, and now they're doing this shit.
Yeah, and I think that plays a little bit into this pride of ownership, because some of these recruits came in wanting to be in the Air Force and were told no. The next best thing is the armored division driving tanks. These dudes hadn't seen tanks before in their lives. Well, they had no idea what a tank looked like.
Well, no one had seen a tank.
No, but at the same time, you have to think, like, their first introduction to this after being denied being able to fly and be a pilot, you immediately see something, you're like, oh, that's a big, fun opportunity.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to make the most of this. Yeah. And just at that young age, like you're saying, it's so young, it's so impressionable. You have so much zeal. You have so much belief that what you're doing over there will make a difference at home because you haven't been beaten down by society yet. And in a way, it scares me to think about how young kids are allowed to go to war. But at the same time, it's almost sadly necessary because they're not in a way to where they have been broken down yet. They're a little bit more elastic to be able to bounce back, hopefully. No?
No, I
Am I lipstick at a pig in this?
Yeah, I think you are maybe a little bit. I look at it from the other perspective of, even at 18, 19, your brain can still be kind of mush.
Yeah.
And there is a reason that you recruit people when they're 18 and 19. It's because they're getting out of a time in their life when they don't really have, a lot of people don't have a direction. They're required to go to high school. They get out of that and they're looking for something to do. It's kind of easy to pull them in with the promise of adventure and all this kind of stuff. But going over there and seeing the things that these kids saw without having time to, here's the thing, getting kicked a little bit and having society grind you down, as shitty as that is, it at least builds up your tolerance to that kind of stuff.
Prepares you.
Yeah, and it can kind of prepare you for nothing can prepare you for this type of shit that you're going to see. But at the same time, you do maybe have a little bit more maturity. And also, like, this is the stuff that you're seeing, and then the entire rest of your life, this stuff just probably fucking haunts you.
Yeah. The 761st was known as a bastard battalion, as a bastard child attests to the same way. They weren't ever attached to a single infantry division or a single air division.
So you would have these bastard battalions. And basically what it meant is they were independent battalions. That meant that they weren't formed with a specific army group or, function in mind. They were meant to be interchangeable. They were meant to be sent over. They could be plugged in wherever they needed to.
Yeah, just plug and play. So they're going to be attached to a lot of different infantry divisions. It's just kind of like they show up where they're asked to go, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Their first combat would come on November 7th, 1944. They were in the towns of Mayvik and Viksersiel. I assume that's right. As the Germans were falling back after the D-Day invasions, they were still held up in these towns, protecting them. They would support the 26th Infantry Division. Bates was actually wounded the night prior to them going into, I believe it was Moivik. And as he's taken out, I think he was replaced by the lieutenant whose name was
his second in command, the guy that was the second in command.
Dave Williams. Another white guy.
Not the Wendy's guy.
Dave Taylor? Was it Dave Williams? Dave Thomas.
Dave Thomas, that's right. Sorry.
Williams was not good at his job. Bates going out kind of started to put the onus on the kind of separate tank commanders that were in these units to protect things. The day after Bates was injured, the lead tank was commanded by a guy named Sergeant Roy King to go into Moivik. He was knocked out immediately by a German Panzerfaust, which you were talking about. It's basically like a rocket launcher.
Yeah, it's kind of like a hand-fired, and basically it has to be fired at closer range. It's an infantry-held weapon, but basically, yeah, it's meant to take out a tank. If anything, just to hit it in the side and try to take out the tracks, because things not going anywhere if you bust the tracks.
Yeah, so this Panzerfaust hits their tank. Roy King gets out in the middle of battle and ends up dragging two of his wounded unit members to safety from the tank.
Well, and the places that they're going into, these aren't places that have already been moved over by the Allies. No. They're pushing. They're now on the line. They're moved up, and all the ground that they take is German-held territory at that point. So even moving into these, any of these little towns that they went into, and a lot of, the time they spend, because it's that initial push after D-Day, it's all of these skirmishes that are going on all along this giant stretch of the line that's just trying to push toward Germany. And so you have all these little skirmishes. They're going to get into little stronghold positions that they have to take from the Germans. It could be a hill. Yeah. They're going to go into these little towns, but everything is going to be fought for and already fortified and prepared, by the Nazis at this point. And so even being the lead tank in this situation going in, being in a tank is already, you would think, well, you're inside, you're in an armored thing, all that stuff. Everything that is not a rifle, all of the artillery, all of the mortars, all of the other tanks, they're all focused on you because you can do the most damage. Infantry alone isn't going to get it done. And so while you're in a position where you're the safest from small arms fire and guns and everything, you're definitely in the worst position regarding all of the actual artillery and the heavy fire.
You're also packed with explosives inside too.
You're riding on a fucking gas tank with just, a bunch of fucking shells in there.
Also, one of the major flaws to the Sherman was it the exhaust pipe that was below that would constantly get clogged by the mud they were going through?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're going, I believe, through France at this point, or was this into Belgium?
This was France. They go into Belgium for the Bulge, I believe.
Okay. So you're still moving through France. Any of the roads that you're hoping to take are going to be defended, are going to be knocked out as the Germans are retreating. They're not going to give you a way to move, your armor and your vehicles in any manner of an easy way. So a lot of this is also, you're going across country. This is in November. In some areas, it's going to be wet. It may have already snowed. And when that stuff melts and you get these 30-ton tanks that are driving through these fields or even on these little dirt roads, they're just completely turning them to mud. And as that mud gets deeper, the tanks may be, trying to get through it. But if they get bogged down and that exhaust becomes stuck in the mud and blocked, it would just funnel all of that exhaust into the tank itself.
Yeah, which is a death trap.
Yeah.
We get Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers coming through in a big way during this. He rolls up to the front of the city, and this road had been blocked off by the Germans. I heard it multiple ways. They said that it was some said it was a tree. Others said it was actually a roadblock that was put in front. Under fire, Reuben Rivers jumps out of his tank, climbs down, runs over to the block in front of the road, wraps a chain around it, runs back to his tank, hooks the chain to the tank, throws it in reverse.
You're missing one of the craziest parts of this.
Huh.
The whatever it was, the log or the block they had completely put mines and explosives all over it. So if something tried to push and ram it, it would explode. He still goes in there under fire, wraps this chain around, then gets back to the tank, and as he's pulling this thing back, it's just fucking exploding. Well, road's clear now you can move in. But you're doing that, and guess what? You're the focal point for all of that fire.
Yeah, you're getting out of your tank the thing that's supposed to protect you from all this fire, completely exposing yourself just so you can get up and pull this out of the way
and get the rest of your guys forward.
Yeah, that was all it was to pull out that roadblock meant that you were able to get into the city. They would capture Morville Les Vic on November 7th. November 10th, Sergeant Warren, I think his name is Sreesi, his Sherman ends up being knocked out by an anti-tank gun. He jumps out, sets the .30 caliber onto his hip.
50.
Was it a 50?
Yeah.
Holy shit. He sets a 50 onto his hip and lays cover fire so his boys could get out, and ends up clearing German machine gun nests, clears out an anti-tank gun. To be able to Arnold Schwarzenegger yourself and jump out and grab the 50 cal and just start laying fire. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think it was the one that was on the top of it, because that was the only gun that was used. You couldn't just rip the other ones, they were attached.
Yeah.
So the 50 that was up at the top was the only one that you could actually take. So yeah, as he's covering and everything, they also, these tanks, the guys that were in the tanks also had these things called grease guns. And they were basically smaller, kind of like a submachine gun. The range on them was maybe an effective range was maybe 50 feet. These things were basically just made that if something happened, the tank broke down and you were having to pop out and try to defend it or grab a gun and try to get away from the tank, it was supposed to give you a fighting chance. But, I imagine that these guys that are trying to escape, he grabs the grease gun, he grabs the 50, he's laying down cover fire. He's going to have to throw that thing down at some point. But essentially to get into those enemy positions and to knock those things out, it's fucking nuts. Your initial reaction is just okay, the tank got taken out. The thing that is supposed to protect me and keep me alive is now non-functional. I need to get the fuck out of here. And he's like, nah, not today.
I imagine his sleeves were blown off in such a fashion that he was just standing outside holding the 50 cal. And
I don't know how you're taking the recoil off that thing.
No, absolutely insane. But he does, and it works. November 16th, again, Staff Sergeant Rivers leads Able Company in an assault on the German-held town of Göbling. His tank hits a landmine. It ends up severely wounding him. He has what's referred to as $1 million wound. It was a gash from his knee to his hip.
Yeah.
They told him, hey, you got to get out of here. We're going to evac you. You're going back home. He says, no, I'm not leaving my guys. He says, that's an order. Rivers looks at him. He says, sir, this is the one order that I'm going to refuse, and goes back into war.
A lot of people, I think people assume that, again, tanks were taken out by other tanks. It was a rarity, it happened and everything. Those are the things you're always going to hear about. It's tank on tank action. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, these tanks were taken out by these anti-tank guns that were basically just guns on two wheels hooked up to the back of a truck to move them and everything. They were, static positions where they were just staying there and they fired. Also, mortars would come in. Also, you had artillery that was farther back behind the line that they were calling in coordinates and everything like that was taking them out. But landmines were also a huge thing because there were only certain places these tanks that were secure enough or that were like not secure enough, supported enough for tanks to actually travel. You had tons of issues with like bridges being able to support tanks and all this kind of stuff. But even just the thing that you would think about a road, because again, this is rural France in the 40s. It's not like everything is paved. There's not fucking highways everywhere. And if there are highways, they're so defended that it's, it's a suicide mission to try to go down these things. So they also know that there's other areas that they're required to go if they have tanks. So of course they're going to be mined. And when you're driving in your tank, even if you got your commander's head sticking out, he doesn't want to be all the way out because then that exposes him to fire. You got your driver maybe looking through the periscope. Your field of vision in front of you probably isn't also providing a lot of detail. And especially when it fucking snows and everything looks white, you can't see shit. So many of these tanks were hit by mines, and if you hit it on the track and the track went over it, it would maybe blow your track off and, it would cause damage. Your tank might get knocked out of commission. But when it was on the inside of that track that caused the pressure, and it was that underbelly of the tank, which was much less armored, that shit would just explode upward. And like you said, shrapnel getting launched into essentially this steel fucking coffin. Not only that, but the concussion and everything. So many of these guys, when these things would get hit, it would be like explosions of shrapnel going on inside the tanks when these rounds penetrated, and guys just got fucking shredded.
It didn't stop Mr. Rivers. Mr. Rivers goes ahead and takes control of another tank and again leads Able Company into the town the very next day. The medic had taken a look at him. He had gangrene in his leg. He just refused to leave his men. He refused to leave his post, and he refused to leave what his country was trying to do. As they got into town, they realized that they were just basically outmanned at this point, and he would go ahead and lay cover fire on all the enemy positions, allowing his company to be able to withdraw. The infection in his leg isn't what stopped him. As he was laying down this cover to get everybody out, I believe the last transmission that they had from him was him yelling, "Back up, back up, back up," as an artillery shell hit his tank and exploded it.
Well, that's the thing is you weren't going to try to turn, because again, 30 miles per hour was going forward.
Yeah.
These things they had a reverse, of course, but it wasn't like high gear.
Single gear, probably.
So when you're trying to reverse on these narrow roads where off to the side is probably maybe a little marshy where you're going to just end up getting bogged down, the only way to get back is to just throw these things in reverse. And if you're the one that's in the front leading and you're a slow moving target, all those guns are going to come down to bear on you. So, I mean, the guys that were leading these were literally leading these charges. Tank commanders could sometimes be in charge of like 3 or 4 tank units that they would be running with. And then you'd have one guy that was in, the lead tank that would kind of be the guy in charge for positioning and maneuvering.
Yeah. And these were situations where if you did have a tank that was blown up and out of commission, if you had members of that unit that were injured, you had the able-bodied men maybe joining up with another tank to come in there and help them or support them or take a position there, where you had to basically relearn all of this shorthand that you had learned with your guys before.
I wonder if because they knew all the roles in the tank, there had to be some type of and that would make perfect sense. Each tank may have, a different way of communicating verbally or something like that, or a different vibe or something like that. But I think the commands, even the nonverbal ones, were pretty universal for them, just to make sure it was this thing where it could be, hey, you guys are missing your gunner. Like, I'm going to step in and be your guys' gunner. You guys are missing your reloader. I'll step in and be your reloader. Like, I can handle all this, and I know exactly how this is going to operate.
It just shows how great and versatile these soldiers were to be able to step in at a moment's notice.
Just in general, any guys driving these tanks, this was the same. These guys were put through and succeeded in all of the same training that everybody else did. So they weren't, cutting any corners and everything, but just going on to say that like all these guys that manned these tanks during World War II, these guys were, in a way kind of like the pilots that were operating the bombers. They had a specialty skill set, but not only was their skill set what they were doing in the tank, they could step into any of those other roles where it might be a little trickier for a navigator to be replaced by a bombardier or by like a co-pilot or something like that. So, I mean, they really focused on this ability to be pretty much reactive to anything.
Well, this is a situation where at home, their respect level was at zero. Nobody respected them. Nobody cared about them. Nobody wanted them around. On the field of battle, being humbled only takes a matter of minutes, a matter of seconds at that point in time. And these white infantry units that they're going in with immediately gained a respect for the 761st because they relied on them to protect them. They relied on them to take out these nests that would just pick them off.
It's like you're being forced into a relationship in that situation, but then the relationship turns into like a mutual admiration because, again, one wasn't going to work without the other. A tank could roll into town, but if it doesn't have infantry, it's not only trying to fight against, every piece of armor in that town and every large gun, also any of those soldiers that are carrying those anti-tank weapons you're having to deal with. Infantry couldn't go in by itself because then again, there's nothing to go ahead and either direct the fire or take out those machine gun nests.
Yeah, you have to work together, and the respect gained on a battlefield happens so much faster because your lives are in each other's hands. The march to the Seigfried Line would kind of continue all the way through November. The Black Panther casualties by the end of November were 156. You had 24 that were killed, 81 that were wounded, 44 of them were non-battle wounds, 14 tanks lost with another 20 damaged in combat. Now, I wondered about this. I'm sure you probably have a better answer than I could come up with. So as these guys are moving through, and they're moving through fairly fast, faster than they believe that they would, as you're losing tanks and as you're having these damaged tanks that you have to work on, are there parts of the supply train that are bringing you new tanks, or are you go into it with what you have, and then eventually when you get a reinforcement, there are more tanks that come?
In this situation, man, where these guys end up, the 761st ends up being in operations kind of on the front of continuous, it's not an everyday we're getting into a battle thing, but most units were put into rotations to where they were pulled off after maybe a couple weeks, maybe like a month. And then they would be pulled back behind the line. They would be given some R&R time. They would be able to go and repair, refit, do all that kind of stuff to their equipment. These guys had 183 days, which is about 6 months of just continuous operations. And because those continuous operations include you moving forward, your supply lines really aren't bringing you in a lot of new tanks.
Yeah.
You have to have a pretty decent amount of time in a location to be able to do stuff like that. They probably were getting them kind of like, there was probably a trickle of that kind of stuff coming in, but these guys relied so much on, there was a huge advantage in being able to actually take ground. So think of it this way. You are, you're moving into a field. There's a tree line on the other side. There's, Germans right there and they're defending it. All of a sudden, a couple of your tanks get hit in this field. If those Germans drive you back, those tanks are lost.
Yeah.
Regardless of what their status is. If you end up still advancing and taking that ground, all of a sudden the engineers just come back in, hook those things up to basically what were like tank towers. They were basically Shermans that just didn't have a gun on them. They were just meant to actually like tow these things, and they were like recovery vehicles. And if you look at a Sherman, it's got these 4 huge like U-shaped hooks, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. That was also so they could winch them up on cranes to load them onto ships. But they would just hook those things up and then just pull them back to be able to repair those. So there was a huge advantage to always be moving forward so you could recover this stuff because, again, they're moving forward so consistently, they're still struggling to bring in as many supplies as they possibly can through like the mulberry harbors. And so, you were mostly replacing parts. Those were able to be put onto trucks to be driven to you and everything. But yeah, I don't think you were getting a lot of actual full-blown replacement tanks.
So 14 tanks lost is fairly significant.
Huge.
The 20 damage could be repaired and brought back up to the front line.
But
just
in
as
how long?
Yeah.
I mean, depending on the damages and everything. If it's got a hole in it, like, how do you end up, you just weld the patch over that hole or something like that?
Especially, well, on something that's cast too.
Yeah.
Like, cast is just going to crack. It's not going to be able to be repaired that easily. In December of 44, the 761st would be pulled from this march to the Seigfried Line to help relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne was the group that was kind of holding the fort in Bastogne at that point in time. They needed relief. Talette was this small town. It was a small Belgian town. I believe it was east of Bastogne.
It was about 12 kilometers west of Bastogne, which, if you go back and listen to the Battle of the Bulge episode, essentially Bastogne was an area that wasn't like, that was the front line. That's where the Germans pushed us back to. No, with the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans actually pushed all the way back past Bastogne, and Bastogne was just this little encircled pocket. So even just being, 12 kilometers, I'm not sure what that relates to for miles, or 15 west of that, you're still trying to push up to relieve Bastogne. That's huge. You're still trying to force, that bulge to go back out to make that line straight again. And initially they were planning on, I think we talked about it during, I'm trying to remember which episode, there was that whole thing between who are we going to, put all the eggs in the basket for, or send the most supplies to. Is it going to be Montgomery, or is it going to be Patton? It ends up being Montgomery, I think, that starts making that push a little bit further to the north. But prior to the breakout for the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans started pushing in, Patton was down south. And I think we talked about during that episode is when he was like, I can have my guys there in 3 days, 2 days?
2 days.
Like something like that, because he had already
He launched him 3 days before.
and this was part of the group. He was like, 761st is heading up there. So they immediately pivoted. They're not going to get any more time to rest or anything like that. They might have had some time since it was supposed to be Montgomery's, big push. But now they're on their way to Bastogne to try to relieve, the 101st that's surrounded.
Well, Bastogne's so crucial because, like you say, it's not on the front lines, but it is kind of the confluence of all of these roads that the Germans could use to resupply, and it was a shot to march towards Antwerp to try to take that harbor, which was their whole plan the whole entire time for the Germans. This town that we were just referring to, Talette, was, Talette was west of Bastogne that you cleared up for me. It held crossroads that were fairly crucial for the German resupply efforts. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which was known as the Elite Ballet, I don't know, fucking German.
Elite Führer Brigade. These were guys that had actually, I believe, fought on the Eastern Front as well and had distinguished themselves. And so, this, at a certain point, you did have a lot of the people trying to push the Allies back as old men and younger boys when they were getting really desperate to try to just field anything they could. But they were throwing in also these crack regiments to kind of hold strong points.
If you were able to make it back from the Eastern Front, you probably were pretty good at what you did.
You probably were just happy. They're like, I'm not fighting the Russians anymore, thank God. Yeah, but the Allies are coming on the other side. They're not the Russians. I don't care.
There were points in time when they would capture some of these Germans and they would talk to them about what they'd seen. And there were Germans that would confess and admit that the only tank battles that they fought against more superior opponents than the 761st were the Red Army. That was how good and how well they respected, even by the Germans. Germans did not like black people. They didn't know a lot about this.
They were scared shitless when they saw them on the battlefield, because I want to say it might have been in the First World War.
Yes.
The Senegalese.
And from the French.
From the French were apparently just fucking crazy.
Vicious.
And just completely instilled this huge fear. And so long ago that it was left over from World War One that they had heard about these guys, and so they saw these black soldiers and they were just like, "Oh fuck!"
There were points in time when there would be Germans that would be walking over to surrender and be taken as prisoners of war, and they would tell the 761st to stay in their tanks just so they wouldn't spook the Germans. They were that scared of them. So they're going up against this elite Führer brigade. The 761st would be paired with the 87th Infantry to take on Tillet in early January 1945. We get just another phenomenal stories. We get Charles Pop Gates on January 9th leading 10 Shermans of C Company of Charlie Company against the height.
It's like the strategic high ground where, of course,
yeah. So the way that the battlefield would be marked out is this wouldn't just be towns that needed to be taken. Mm-hmm. There were actually images going over, like pinpointing ridges. Like this is Hill 329. This is Hill 786.
Any defensible high ground advantageous position had been reinforced and was essentially a German stronghold.
Yeah. So they were tasked, these 10 Shermans were supposed to be taking this high ground near Tillet. It was held by German tanks. There was an anti-tank gun up there, and there was also infantry up there. Sergeant Theo Windsor's tank was knocked out early. Windsor would then climb out of his tank and climb into Sergeant William McBurney's tank and just like continue on. Like, hey, open up your hatch. Let me jump in.
Yeah.
Let me make this happen. The tank would push all the way beyond the enemy lines. So they would get all the way back in there and just start causing havoc. They were blowing up installations. They were attacking nests. Eventually, their tank is disabled. Windsor and McBurney, and I'm blanking on the tank driver's name. I know it was the tank driver, though, would hike back 3 miles through the snow and mud back to American lines. So they drove their tank beyond enemy lines, fucked shit up. When they were disabled, they lived to march back, run back 3 miles to get back.
We're going straight back the way we came because we know we at least took out as much as we could in that area.
And this was kind of the turning point at Tillet. There's so many stories that come out of this stuff. Pop Gates would also be knocked out in that same battle, but he would actually take radio command outside of his tanks to be able to guide everybody else that were still in the fight. Just things like that. It was these dudes, no matter if they were disabled, if they were knocked out, if they were injured. And I'm sure that this goes for any of the other tank regiments too. This is just one that we need to focus on because it doesn't get as much shine as everybody else. But these dudes were down for the cause no matter what. Charlie Company would end up taking Tillet that same day that Pop was knocked out by nightfall. So you finally get this securing of Tillet, which then starts the relief efforts that are going on in Bastogne that start to make this pushback to flatten this bulge out and stop Hitler's final offensive, his final major offensive.
Yeah. And just kind of going back to the aspect of like the personal stories and everything. And, every group of like the tankers or regiments probably had, stories that were similar. But, listening to that audiobook that we listened to about, what was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was one of the guys that helped get it done.
Yes.
So you had situations where their tank got bogged down. I can't remember which group of guys it was, but their tank gets bogged down. It gets sunk down in the mud. And all of a sudden, because the exhaust is bogged down, it starts pumping in the exhaust into the tank. And they had this one guy who was like the skinniest guy. He was their canary in the coal mine. He ends up passing out. And they're like, oh shit, he just passed out. The fumes are too bad. We got to get the fuck out of here. And as they're getting out of the tank and pulling this guy out of the tank, he's not coming to. He's not responding. And
Leonard Smith is his name.
Leonard Smith. And all of a sudden, they heard something coming down the road. And they were like, shit, that's, the Germans are coming down the road. They're trying to revive him. They think he's actually dead. And so they end up, making it back to where their lines were. This guy ends up waking up as these Germans are approaching. He's laid across the top of the tank, out the top hatch. And he's like, oh fuck. And he just ends up laying back down in the same position and playing dead. Germans move by, say a couple things. They don't even bother him and they just keep moving on. He gets up and he gets the fuck out of there after they're like out of earshot and out of sight and ends up making it back.
Well, no. He gets up. he wakes up the next day and is heading back. He's the one that runs into the German soldier that holds his gun up. And as he holds his gun up, Smith is like, well, shit, this guy's going to kill me. Realizes that this guy is actually surrendering to him.
Right. Yeah.
And he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know how to get back to the American lines. So he basically takes the dude's rifle, puts it in his back, and makes the guy march towards he thinks where the American lines are. So Smith...
Where are your lines? He's like, over there. He's like, we're going the opposite direction because that's probably where my guys are.
Smith shows up at camp. Everybody thought that he had died. His guys in his unit that were in his tank come back and tell everybody that he died. And all of a sudden, the next day, he comes walking back into camp, not alone.
With the German POW.
He'd taken a German POW on the way back.
Dude, what the fuck?
They also, liberating these towns wasn't such a bad deal for them. Because these towns in France, what's France known for in the Champagne region of France? Champagne. They would go into these... what do you call that? Like a vineyard?
Well, that's for wine. Champagne would be...
Champagne's sparkling wine.
Well, yeah. I'm just trying to think where they would be doing like the distilling or the processing. It wouldn't be a vineyard, but it was basically like a big factory where they had actually made or processed and bottled the champagne. And they end up like pulling cases out. Like I'm sure any group of soldiers that was in there was just like case. And so they end up, getting this supply of like champagne, get a couple down nights where they're not having to, do anything. They get to celebrate a little bit. There was an instance where they had gotten like a 50-gallon barrel of cognac, and one of them had strapped it to the outside of the tank. And I guess some like British soldiers or something were passing them by, and they were talking about, they're like, what's on the back? They're like, it's cognac. They're like, can we have something? He's like, yeah, help yourself, man.
Do you think it was Hennessy?
I don't know.
Do you imagine when the French came back and they're going through whatever the factory is? They're like, we're missing a bunch of champagne. And the Americans were like, the Germans took it with them when they left.
I think it was just more of a you're welcome type thing. Small price to pay.
Yeah, this is just the liberation tax.
We figured you were just going to give it to us anyway.
Us taking a 50-gallon barrel of cognac that we're not going to do anything but just strap to the back of the tank.
And hope it doesn't get hit by any fire.
We also see the advent of mascots for some of these tanks.
I don't think it's the advent, but you see situations in which tanks start, maybe one tank it has itself a mascot. And that mascot just so happened to be a rooster that they had found.
Just hanging out one day, it walks up on the side of the tank and just ended up staying. I'm sure it was probably because they were providing it with some sort of food.
Yeah, but it was in like a firefight. Like, there was shit going on around it, and the chicken was just like, I'm just going to hang on this tank. And so it kind of became their mascot. I mean, they fed it and everything, but there was a situation where they were driving. Didn't the chicken jumped off, and the tank commander stopped the tank. He's like, hold it. He's like, go get the chicken. One of the guys is like, what? I'm not going out there. He's like, go get the chicken.
We're in a war zone.
Yeah.
You want me to get out of this protector?
And just walk, like trying to catch it. But I mean, I guess, it was the little things that these guys had to hold them on. But I don't know if I don't think the chicken lasted the entire war. Can you imagine just seeing it? All it takes is one little rifle.
Yeah.
Take out that and imagine just it's your mascot, the demoralization from losing your mascot.
It's just a chicken. A cold day could ruin your mascot.
That's the other thing, too. Yeah, this had to have been early on when they got there, because it wasn't going to be snow and frozen out there.
No, it just incredible, the little things. And hearing these stories, we don't remember all the names to them, but these little stories almost just kind of make me smile, because that's their attempt at just trying to feel any sort of normalcy.
It's like a gallows humor.
Yeah, they get attached to a chicken as a pet because they had these things back at home, or just even having a pet in general provides like just a little bit of extra joy in your life.
This thing is the only thing that will stay on this tank when we're going through this shit.
Yeah.
One thing too, when they were like, Battle of the Bulge, and also because that was occurring, later, winter is going to last a little bit longer in that area. These tanks that they're the Shermans are green. They stand out against a completely white background. Whereas, and not only that, but the soldiers also were just wearing their fatigues. So I mean, it's a stark contrast to the environment. Whereas the Germans had painted a lot of their tanks white with camouflage. A lot of their soldiers had like the white winter gear, and so another huge danger was these tanks literally like driving into these fields or driving into an area, and they start taking fire and they're looking around and they can't see where they're getting hit from.
Well, I'm gonna need some help with this word again that I asked you about last night. Bivouac.
Yeah.
Is that right? Bivouac apparently just means hunker down for the night in something temporary. It's like a tent or something
Nope,
that you can.
that's the condition. It's hunkering down without a tent or shelter.
Okay.
So it's literally just like pulling off out into a field and sleeping right there.
Or sleeping inside your tank.
Well, what happens in the winter when you're sleeping inside a giant steel contraption with no heat aside from the engine that was running, but you couldn't run the engine all the time because you needed to conserve gas.
Blankets were currency back then. That was your one way of insulating yourself, and to lock yourself away in something that conducts the cold so much like that steel does.
It's like like when you go into like a porta potty after it's been super cold outside, and even though the sun's been up to warm a little bit, you walk in that porta potty and it's 10 degrees fucking colder. Like you could keep fucking deli meats frozen in there. Yeah.
It almost serves as like an anti-griddle. Leonard Smith, the guy that we talked about before that came back from the dead with a POW, said that it was so cold inside the tanks that he actually preferred getting out of the tank, digging a hole in this partially frozen muddy dirt, laying blankets down and sleeping in there, because that was somehow less cold than trying to sleep in one of these tanks in the wintertime in the Ardennes.
And then flip the other side, because these things were used in so many other places than just, Northern Europe. Think of being down in fucking like Africa, Northern Africa, in one of these things, and it's the exact opposite. These things will fucking scald you.
Yeah, it's not a good life. We were talking about this just at the beginning of the week. I always try to bounce around like what role could I play, and ultimately there's zero role that I could have played in World War II. I wouldn't have survived any of it. I wouldn't have survived basic training.
It was a different fucking breed of generation, man. Like I was thinking about this the other day too, of just kind of what those guys had to do. And of course, it's a circumstance of like, what are you capable of? You never know what you're capable of until you're in that situation. But just at the same time, like, these are people that witnessed like so many fucking horrible things and then just came back and really didn't talk about it and went about their lives. And it's just like, fuck yeah, that was just a different like fucking breed of person.
Well, from all of the talk that we've done about dogfights and Allied bombing campaigns and this and that, I've crossed being in an airplane off my list of things that I could do. Being closer to the ground, there's less of a chance. I mean, if you get hit once up there and your plane goes down, you're not surviving that unless you're unless you're hitting the eject and you have your tent or your parachute. So I figure maybe being on the ground, being in a tank has to be great. Well, after doing this episode, it sounds like being in a tank is awful too.
Yeah, well, man, here's the thing. The ejection seat in those planes was a lot like the ejection seat in this tank. It was non-existent. In a plane, you were
really?
Oh, yeah, man.
They didn't have ejection seats?
No. It was a fucking just leather seat that you were sitting in, and to get out of the plane, you had to pop the canopy off and climb out of the plane and jump.
They were wearing parachutes, though, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, my God. Even worse. Even more so to keep me out of the air.
Yeah.
But then to think about what they had to go through in these tanks and to just know that you are basically sitting in the middle of a grenade, a grenade / Molotov cocktail.
Kind of.
And you're being fired at because you're the biggest thing on the battlefield that needs to be taken out first.
You're constantly hearing just the sound of shit hitting against the outside of the tank at high velocity. And then you hear the ting, 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 ting of all like the small arms fire. And then every so often you hear a like something like bouncing off and like, and then all of a sudden something hits you directly and just rocks the shit out of the fucking tank, or a mortar or a fucking shell explodes right next to you and you can feel it jostle. And you're just going to keep fucking driving forward.
Yeah, I think laundry I would probably be pretty good at if there was just a laundry position.
I'm sure there was something like that.
They could put me in like Britain or something.
Yeah.
That's the only place I think I could live, because I know a foot soldier is not the life for me either.
You could be back making the hot chow.
It's true. Yeah, I could do this. But then we hear about Pearl Harbor when they get bombed, and it was the commissar or the chef that ended up going up and manning the anti-aircraft guns?
Yeah, that was that guy. I'm not saying you're gonna. You
I
might
wouldn't have done
a
it.
rifle. Yeah, but I mean, you could be back at you could be cooking for the officers or like the command structure.
I'd be a pet. I'd be a good pet, I think, is just about it.
You'd be an executive assistant.
So, following Tilley, getting back to our story, the 761st would lead the way for the 4th Armored Division into Germany, as they were going to go through this undermanned Seigfried Line. And the reason that it was so undermanned is because Hitler had put so much effort into this last offensive that they were just running out of bodies. Mm-hmm. The Seigfried Line was pretty incredible. I forgot to write down the distance of it, but this thing was fortified with what were known as dragon's teeth, were just basically giant triangular concrete, look like dragon's teeth.
Yeah, it looks like if someone just took a pyramid and buried like half of it, and it was just the point that was sticking out, but then had that just in rows and rows and rows. It was essentially to prevent any type of travel for armored vehicles getting over that, because as much as these tanks could, different types of terrain, they're not getting over that shit. A bunch of, what do they call them, like the Chechen hedgehogs, the Belgian gates, and everything. But the Seigfried Line was basically the Germans' answer to the Maginot Line that the French had built. The French built it to keep the Germans out. And in this situation, the Germans built it to keep everybody else out if they had to fall back to that position. There were still ways through it and everything, but those ways were also going to be choke points that were going to be heavily defended. So you were going to pay for it if you tried to go to those locations.
Stretched over more than 630 kilometers or 390 miles.
Yeah, but knowing about Hitler's long-stretching construction projects,
True.
Atlantic Wall being an example, you were probably shown some pretty cool pictures of it.
Yeah.
And also the line is going to be one of those situations where it has natural barriers and defenses, rivers, mountains, things like that. But it was still something they had to get through, still something that the Germans had the advantage in defending.
Well, we're talking about 390 miles. You can't defend every single inch of a 390-mile line.
No.
And if you're going to do that, you're going to stretch your resources so thin that eventually when an engagement happens, you're going to be trying to rush guys 300 miles away.
You're going to be in a reverse bulge.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
going to just be bulging out the other way, your direction.
And it did work out pretty well because they end up breaking through this Seigfried Line. It took them, I believe it was 72 hours. Yeah. 72 hours to break through into the Rhineland. And that was the whole idea behind the Seigfried Line, was it was the line that defended the Rhineland, the
jewel and the industrial hub, because the Ruhr Valley, I think, was part of the Rhineland. And so that was kind of their breadbasket for industry there. It was also symbolically super, super important to the German people. And so taking that was not only like a strategic victory, but also kind of a moral victory as well.
And wasn't it the first thing that Hitler took back?
Yeah.
So this is a very important thing for them to end up breaking through, because this was kind of like their last thing before this direct march to Germany. The Black Panthers were one of the first Americans. This blew me away. This absolutely blew me away. They weren't heading towards Germany. They had what was Stalin and Churchill and FDR's meeting?
The Casablanca conference, the one in Tehran.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Tehran conference. Where they kind of felt, okay, Putin's on his way to Berlin. He's going to, Jesus Christ, Stalin.
Same time.
Yeah, close. One's molded in the image of the other one. That Stalin was headed on his way to Berlin. They were probably going to end up taking that. There was this belief that there was like an area towards Austria that was like had a cache of weapons, and it was supposed to be where if the Nazis ended up losing and the Germans ended up losing the war, that then they could back into and almost keep continuing to fight in a guerrilla style.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense to think about that. I mean, they've been doing all this other crazy shit during the war. You're kind of looking for any and every situation that can happen. And so if you even suspect that there were troop movements or a buildup of arms there, your initial reaction is going to be like, well, they're using this as kind of a last stand or something like that. The other thing, too, is this is at a point when they're having the Tehran conference. They're starting to talk about post-World War II Europe and what it's going to look like and who's going to take ownership or stewardship of what areas. And this is where kind of the ideas that are kicked around for the division of Germany is going to kind of come to light, where it's, dividing Germany itself, but then also dividing Berlin. Berlin being closer, if you guys have listened to the Berlin Wall episode, it's much closer to what the Soviet held territory was at the time than it was actually going to be to the area where the Allies controlled it in Germany, East Germany, West Germany. And so the thought process was also that Stalin was already going to beat them to Berlin. He was going to get that much closer. And there were the projections of how many Allied soldiers, even if we tried to make a spearhead march there and get there, and we got to Berlin first, what was it going to cost us? Well, the projection was it's going to cost 100,000 Allied casualties. Ends up being 300,000 for the Soviets when they actually get there. So the estimations of what it would have taken to take the city, had the Allies, on the western side got there, it would have been way more than that. And I think even that number of 100,000, they looked at that and they said, well, we've already got an agreement in place that we're going to divide up Germany at this point. So it's not super necessary for us to get all the way into that area and end up losing a whole bunch of guys, especially, in the last innings of this war. And so just getting kind of into that German territory, though, especially for like Patton, was extremely important because they needed at least have a foot to say like, no, we were in Germany too. Like that's why we're going to have this territory. And so getting across, I think they got across the Rhine, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And they got into, it was Stier?
Stier in Austria.
In Austria. And that was where they actually had met up with the Red Army. And as they end up pulling up and the Red Army ends up showing up, I think they said that one of the tanks, the top hatch opened up and this woman got out of it.
This is my favorite story from that book that we read or listened to. It's Leonard Smith again.
Yeah. And so he sees this woman get out of the tank and she just runs over to him and wraps him in this fucking bear hug and is just saying, she's saying American and everything is she's bear hugging him. She's lifting him up and squeezing him. He's like, I thought this chick was going to fucking break my ribs. Like she was a sturdy gal and she was just, and it makes perfect sense because if you're going to tell me that a Soviet woman is climbing out of a tank, I'm going to think she's going to walk out. She's going to fucking be bottle of vodka being like,
I see her as the baddest woman on the planet at that point in time. To be able to be a woman in the Red Army, but also be
tank commander, probably if she's the first one out of there. They're not going to like tap the driver and be like, hey, do you want to get out first?
The amount of respect that woman had to claim from those just dogs that were in the Red Army. It's just incredible. And I don't mean dogs in the worst way because I kind of think that they had a point. We talked about it during the Stalingrad episode.
They had that dog in them.
Yeah, but Operation Barbarossa was a very direct and grotesque, to put it in the easiest terms possible, raping of the area and the people in that area that just saw unspeakable tragedies.
It was an atrocity off.
Huh?
It was just an atrocity off both ways. Moving in, the Germans committing as many as they possibly could. As soon as they started getting pushed out, the Germans were like, oh, okay, fair game then. And they just fucking did the exact same thing, especially after they got into the German territory. It was just like, it's time to repay the favor.
And they, I think, repaid it
in kind.
One of the things that came out of this that it had never really crossed my mind as far as we had known about it. Chris and I have been talking about the 761st for a few months now, trying to figure out when to do this episode because it's so important. For a very, very, very long part of World War II, we were not privy to the concentration camps that were happening inside of Austria and Germany.
Yeah, because they were inside. You're not going to see those from the air and be able to. The idea of prisoner of war camps, sure. Those have happened in every conflict. Concentration camps, work camps, death camps, that's something that didn't really enter the minds of what was, of the Allies, of what was going on in Germany at the time. It's kind of one of the reasons why when these, groups would roll up on these concentration camps and these death camps, when they reported back what they found, it was unbelievable until, the command actually saw this shit for themselves. And one of the things, I think it was May 4th in 45, the Black Panthers and the 71st Infantry, they ended up liberating, it was Gunskirchen concentration camp, and they freed around 15,000 Hungarian Jews. And they said when they rolled up, it was just like these ghosts walking out, these insanely frail, emaciated people. And it almost took them a minute to kind of come to the realization that these were humans that they were actually seeing. And it's one of those things where you can't really fathom what's going on. And the Russians are also, the Soviets are also telling them like, oh no, like we've come across like quite a few of these things. Like this isn't just here. Like this is one of many. And I think Gunskirchen was actually part of the
it was a satellite.
Satellite of which one? Dachau?
I don't. It was another very long word. Look it up while I get this quote. This came from Captain J.D. Pletcher. He says, as we entered the camp, the living skeletons still able to walk crowded around us, and though we wanted to drive further into the place, the milling and pressing crowd wouldn't let us. It's not an exaggeration to say that almost every inmate was insane with hunger. Just the sight of an American brought cheers, groans, and shrieks. People crowded around to touch an American, to touch the Jeep, to kiss our arms, perhaps just to make sure that it was true. The people who couldn't walk crawled towards our Jeep. Those who couldn't even crawl propped themselves up on an elbow, and somehow, through all their pain and suffering, revealed through their eyes the gratitude, the joy that they had felt upon the arrival of the Americans.
It was Mauthausen.
Mauthausen?
Yeah.
So they liberated a camp of 15,000 Hungarian Jews.
There was a sub-camp for this other fucking camp.
And they did say, that, again, we're splitting hairs just saying this. This wasn't a death camp. This was a work camp, which, again, it doesn't fucking matter.
Potato.
Were so bad. But these were people that were literally being worked to death.
That's the whole point. Like, what is your distinction here? Okay, well, this one's not considered a death camp because it didn't have the ovens and the gas chambers. So technically, it was kind of a camp where we could just work them, and then as a result of the work, they died.
And instead of burning them, we just kind of stacked the bodies around.
Yeah.
And again, forgot to point that out when we were talking about it. This is May 4th. Didn't Hitler pop himself April 20th?
No, that's his birthday.
April 18th, then?
It's close. I'll check.
Somewhere around there. So we're talking about a matter of weeks after Hitler had killed himself, the Germans had capitulated, and we're just finding these things out then.
April 30th.
April 30th. Okay, so 5 days.
5 days.
5 days. I don't know if the capitulation had happened that quickly after Hitler offed himself.
No, I think Donitz was still working on it. He was still trying to get some type of conditional surrender, and that's when Ike was like, motherfucker, there ain't going to be no conditions to this surrender.
Well, and at that point in time, I'm sure that's sort of perfect evidence when they're like, conditional surrender, and like, concentration camps. He's like, never mind. Mm-hmm. No conditions. You're right. You win.
We've got some disturbing reports back from some camps that have been being found. So we're going to do an investigation into that. And then we're going to table this, and then we're going to come back to this surrender talk.
Yeah. Or you can just full blown surrender.
Yeah.
We'll look into it later. The 761st was deactivated June 1st, 1945. It took about a year for everybody to get back from Germany. I guess it was just based upon like conditions of days there per their rankings.
So they did a point system, from what I understand. They were kept there as kind of an occupying force and everything. Of course, a ton of soldiers had to stay there for an extended period of time as that occupying force. But you could earn a series of points based on how many, I guess, campaigns or engagements you were in, how long you had been there also contributed to your points. I want to say if you had been wounded in combat, it was worth some portion of points. Jeez. And by the end of the war, if you had enough points, you would be allowed to head back to the States. If not, you would have to stay there under occupation duty for a while. And in some circumstances in Europe, they were even talking about if you didn't have enough points, you were going to be sent over to finish fighting the Pacific War. And there were guys that had jumped. I know from the airborne and everything, there were guys that had jumped and landed in Normandy during the D-Day invasion that at the end of the war still did not have enough points to go home.
No.
So, I mean, it was tricky. It was kind of like the situation where the bombers had to have initially 25 missions and then it got bumped up to 35 missions, except fuck, man, I think the bombing missions were probably even harder to get.
Yeah, a mission's an hour long. Staying for an extended period of occupational time is days that
Yeah.
you could be shot at, killed, anything like
Mhm.
that. Upon returning stateside, they weren't met with the same parades and congratulations that the white battalions and troops were.
That double V campaign was still the single V for the victory in Europe.
Yeah, things didn't change a whole lot. It absolutely blows me away, and we're going to be doing episodes on this.
Didn't change initially. There wasn't a recognition essentially of an acknowledgement of being like, so like everybody pretty much fought really well, like all these trepidations and all these previous beliefs we had. Yeah, they were kind of unfounded. There was really no recognition of that initially.
Well, up until this point during wars, even if you were a black man coming home from war, you were believed to have been in a, what were we talking about, supporting role.
Yeah.
You weren't believed to be out on the front lines, much less running tanks.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a story that becomes hard to believe for anybody stateside because this wasn't being reported on.
and it was also such a small percentage of the overall. Yeah.
It just changes everything. As far as trying to be able to come back and tell your story and having people not believe you. For as angry as I think I would be about not being celebrated coming home, to tell somebody what I did and be like, you're a black man. You weren't running a tank over there. You were in a support role. You were cooking in a kitchen somewhere. That I think would be the absolute worst for me, is to just be denied for what I was doing over there. Shockingly enough, it would take another 20 years before the Voting Rights Act would be signed, I believe, by LBJ, that would ban the literacy test used for black people voting in the South. And this was just another way around disenfranchising them. As far as some of the things would be like, you would have to take a test where you would recite the Constitution, and then you would go into detail about certain aspects of the Constitution and what they stood for and what they meant. Stuff that most Americans, a good majority of Americans would never, 99% of Americans would never be able to recite the Constitution, let alone be able to explain the intricacies of it.
The percentage of American citizens who, if they were presented with the U.S. citizenship test and put in front of them to pass it, is a staggering percentage of people that could not pass that test.
Yeah,
Just some food for thought.
I mean, full disclosure here, I've never seen it, but I bet for two guys that have studied as much history as we have and taken interest in this, it wouldn't be terribly easy for us.
No, I mean, we also have talked about a lot of different things, and trying to remember all that shit is pretty fucking difficult. But
we also were given 12 plus years of American education here too.
Exactly, yeah.
Just shocking, these numbers. One thing that did come fairly quickly after this, after they returned home from war, July 26, 1948, forgot to mention this, Truman fully integrates the Army. Big step for the rights of these guys coming back to know that their fighting over there would make a difference, at least in the Army, that integration would take place after that. The 761st would have to wait until January 24th of 1978 for Jimmy Carter to award the battalion with a Presidential Unit Citation. Eisenhower and Patton somehow, some way, decided to not put the 761st up for unit citation after seeing Patton firsthand and Eisenhower getting all of the reports from the bravery and the shit that they did out there, the supporting roles that they played in protecting the infantry, the barriers that they not crossed because of the color of their skin, but because they were such good soldiers.
Well, the simple fact of the matter is this: if you were to go ahead and compare, another tank battalion or tank unit that did receive some of these citations and put them side to side, there were tank battalions that were, white tank battalions that had lesser accomplishments than the 761st that received these citations. So no matter how much you want to slice it, it's just simply like, we want to state this thing about a meritocracy, and it's all based on like performance and all that kind of stuff. But in this situation, it definitely wasn't. And it was just simply because of, who this company and who this battalion was made up of.
Well, we're going to stack these awards up. I'm not sure where this lies. I'm sure there's battalions that had more. I'm sure there's battalions that had way, way less that are looked at as very respectable battalions. They would end up with a presidential citation, as I just mentioned for Jimmy Carter, one Medal of Honor that Reuben Rivers would receive posthumously in 1997 from Bill Clinton. 1997. Yeah. This happened in 1945. He doesn't get his Medal of Honor until 1997. Mm-hmm. That's how long this takes. They would receive 296 Purple Hearts, 8 with clusters, which means just multiple Purple Hearts, 11 Silver Stars, and 69 Bronze Stars. Just such a decorated battalion for what they did over there that were recognized. And they said that all of these estimates for the awards that they were given are all on the low end, just based upon what they know, not what they didn't care to look into, not what they didn't care to research.
Stuff they couldn't ignore.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible to see what these guys did in battle.
And I mean, the combination of guys that had served in the infantry with distinction, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st, all those guys that contributed, even the guys that were in the support roles, the Red Ball Express, everyone that was contributing there, although they didn't get that recognition when they first came home, they didn't get essentially the ticker tape parades that they should have gotten, just like everybody else. At least in, 3 years later, and it should have, never been a thing. But they did accomplish something. Yes. They can look at that and say that the integration of the Army is as a direct result of the actions that we took. But yeah, and I mean, they were put up essentially at several points for like the presidential unit citation, everything, and were declined. And it took, campaigning and stuff like that and several people to take a look at this. I think one of them was like the governor of Michigan or something like that had to put it before, the president, and was like, hey, you need to take a look into this. And there was finally some recognition, provided.
It just took so long. And thankfully it did happen, but it's a shame that it took this long to be able to celebrate these guys after most of them had died, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Just terrible that it takes that long. But at the same time, we don't talk about the 761st as like you need to feel guilty about this. You need to feel guilty about what happened as Americans. You don't. You just need to know about this. This is something that we need to recognize and understand that in war, there is no color. Mm-hmm. The only color that you see in war is just red.
Red, yeah.
And to know that these guys went over there and saw a whole hell of a lot of red and some actual atrocities, and were able to come back and not further their goals to what they had hoped, but to be able to force that integration and then to get the ball rolling on the civil rights movement.
Fighting for the hope that things would get better, fighting for the hope that they would be recognized as equals, dealing with the shit going through basic training and everything like that. Just doing that because of the hope, not knowing, but doing it just because, hey, this is where I'm from. This is the country I live in. This is the country that I love. And I want to make this country better, not for just for myself, but for, everyone that comes after me. I hope that this helps. And it was just doing that. These guys were guys that had, enlisted and volunteered to do this kind of stuff. So it wasn't like they were just put in this situation. These guys were, they stepped up. They knew they were going to have to fight, not just the fight against, the Germans. They were going to be fighting, multiple battles, of all kinds. But yeah, like Adam said, we don't do these kind of episodes to be like, oh, everyone should feel guilty about this shit or anything like that. But there is a big difference between feeling guilty about something and being aware of something and looking at something that happened like this and saying like, man, these guys were given an opportunity that they should have been given long before. They made the most of this opportunity. And although it took some time, they were able to affect change based on their actions.
Well, to know that now we can tell these stories more clearly, the Tuskegee Airmen and the Black Panthers, there are more groups out there. There's segregated infantry, black forces that were out there. And
the fucking Harlem Hellfighters during World War I.
Yeah. Those are the things that we don't necessarily need to put up as these guys were excellent and the best of the best, but these guys were exemplary soldiers that had to face the rigors that nobody else had to.
It's a situation where they're doing the same thing that all these other soldiers were doing. They're doing it at a very high level, but they're also doing this with a giant chip on their shoulder, fighting a different type of fight just to be able to contribute and fight this fight.
Yeah.
They had to fight just to fucking be able to fight like this.
For the betterment of our country and the safety of our people.
Yeah. All right, man. You got anything else?
No, there's certainly more stories with these guys that we could get into. I think we've held you guys for long enough. And these guys are a part of a lot of the stories that we talked about. Talking, just recently, a couple months ago, about the Battle of the Bulge, and then hearing about how these guys affected that is incredible.
If you guys are interested too, the book that we and Adam had kind of pulled quite a bit of the information off of was Brothers in Arms. It's a great listen. It breaks into more of the personal details and the stories of these guys and kind of what they went through, not only through basic training, but also during the war itself. And then kind of gives you a kind of a peek of what happened after the war for some of these guys and why they had chosen to fight. So if you have some time, check it out.
Think we're good?
I think we're good.
All right, fellas, ladies, thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting through another lesson. We will see you next week. Peace.
Later. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit him with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.